Hello, everyone, and welcome again to Criminal Investigation, Homicide Investigation. Today, we are discussing the preliminary investigation. And when I say preliminary, I mean the very, very preliminary investigation of the scene, um, the very early arrivals. So if you recall, last class we discussed first responders and first responders' duties when they arrive to a scene. Obviously, the first and foremost duty they have is to preserve life, then to arrest the suspect, and then to protect the scene. All right, and it kind of goes in that hierarchy. That being said, patrol officers, will normally call detectives if there is a deceased body that they find. So let's jump into what the role of detectives are as soon as they get the phone call from police or from dispatch that they need to go out to a scene. So when we think about homicide detectives, right, they're really guided by four principles: observe, describe, record, and collect. Now, it seems kind of like a boring list, right? But it's literally how detectives work. Most of the detective's job is just observing and recording, because detectives can kind of see the bigger picture. They can put things together, realize that even the smallest details are some of the most important. And we'll talk about different ways evidence can get challenged in court and why it's so important that detectives be very vigilant. So again, they also will collect the evidence to the degree that CSI, they'll direct CSI to collect the evidence. Now, that being said, since detectives are very, very rarely first responders, right? It's very rarely that you're going to see a detective be a first responder to a homicide. Like, that just, it doesn't happen. They obviously have to be methodical, and they cannot overlook obvious details, and they have to record even the most basic details, right? So when I say they have to record even the most basic details, this really begins with as soon as the detective or the detective unit is notified of the homicide or suspected homicide. This is where, at this juncture, recording, observing, describing, and collecting begins by the homicide detective. So, what happens when you get a call as a detective that there is a potential homicide that you need to investigate? So, you probably have seen in TV shows, detectives always have these notebooks with them, and they flip to a new page whenever they get a call or something like that. That's partially true. So detectives will absolutely use a notepad, right? So patrol officers, they carry notepads with them. They'll take notes of everything that they see. Detectives will do the same thing. They carry notepads with them. Now, that being said, to avoid confusion, to avoid later problems in court, you really should use a new notepad for every homicide investigation, right? So you're going to record a ridiculous number of notes, and even trying to get things straight in your head later, as you kind of go back and you revise your notes, you don't want to have more than one investigation on the same legal pad. And again, it's for clarity, but it's also at the end of the day for preserving the best evidence that we can for a court of law. So that being said, the first entry should be the report of the responding officers and the ambulance crew, right? So the very first thing that they're going to put in there is They're going to put the date and time that they were notified of the homicide or the suspected homicide. They're going to put in how they were notified, right? So remember, we use secure telephone. We do not broadcast it via our traditional radio. We use this, again, secure cell phone, so that we don't attract onlookers and people who will come to the scene and potentially mess things up, or even give clues or hints to possible perpetrators of what we're doing. So your method of transmission is usually going to be received a phone call from officer so-and-so, or dispatch received a call from officer so-and-so, dispatch then patch officer so-and-so through to me. However it is, they're going to be very specific. And we have to be that specific even just at the beginning, right? Of this is when I got the call. Because time, as we'll see, becomes a very important thing. So, right, so we're going to have our date and time of notification. We're going to have our method of notification. Then we're also going to find the identity and record the identity of the responding officers, right? So the first responders. And we are going to complete the details of the event from the 911 call to the present moment, right? So basically what's going to happen is you're going to talk to the responding officers. You're going to talk to the ambulance crew that probably responded. And you're going to get step by step and meticulous detail. All right, officer, let's say Jones, Officer Jones. So what time did you receive notification of a potential assault, or whatever the underlying call was? And Officer Jones should be able to tell them. And again, most things are in the computer nowadays, so it's not like we have to call dispatch every time. But Officer Jones should be able to say, well, I received the phone call, or I received dispatch at this point in time. I was at this location. I activated my lights, activated my siren, and I proceeded to the location in question. I arrived at the location in question at such and such time. And the detectives will stop that officer and say, okay, how did you get there? Right. So it's not enough for detectives just to know that they received the notification, the officer received the notification, and then the officer arrived, that time frame, which is important. But they're also going to know, how did you get there? Right? Which streets did you take? Because there's a lot of information that we can garner, especially in the day of cameras, right? And police cars all having cameras and body cameras. It's very possible that depending on your route, you may have passed the perpetrator and not even realized it, right? So we're going to want to know the route. And we're also going to, usually first responders, they have a very good command of their location. They're usually kind of set up in one area, and they know that area very well. But detectives are going to be nosy, right? And they're going to ask, so why did you choose that route? Right? If there was a faster route, why didn't you choose that route? And they're asking these questions not to make the line officer's life difficult. They're asking these questions because they know that somebody like me, a defense attorney, is going to ask those questions, right? Implying that if you had taken a different route, that maybe you could have saved this person's life, right? So they're just trying to CYA, right? Cover your ass. So they're going to ask the detective all about how they got there. They're going to ask the detective, all right, so you arrived at the address at such and such time. What did you do? Well, I saw this was happening, so I got out, and they're going to pause you. They're going to say, okay, so you put your car into the park, right? Yes. Okay, what did you do in your vehicle? Well, I notified dispatch that I had arrived. Okay, that was a missing detail that we didn't get before. right? And even though it's an obvious detail, again, we need to know everything step by step. We cannot have enough information, right? So you notify dispatch that you arrived, you requested backup. Then what'd you do? I opened the door. Okay. Were you armed? I was. Okay. So you opened your car door, you got out, presumably. Where did you stand? Did you stand behind the door and in that kind of location? Or did you kind of run to this body or the scene? What did you see? And so Officer Jones is going to tell them all about that. When he arrived at the crime scene, he saw that there was really nobody around, but there was a body lying in this driveway of this house. So he holstered his weapon. He didn't lock the holster in case he needed to retrieve it. The safety was off. Right, we're going to need to know that. And said, I looked around, made sure it was safe, ran to the body, and could tell pretty much right away that the person is deceased. Well, yeah, officers are going to have some questions here, right? Did you call for an ambulance? Did you check a pulse? Did you look at eye dilation? Right? Did you look for respiration? Did you perform CPR? They're going to have all these questions. And all these questions are extremely important, even in cases that would be really obvious. Like Officer Jones says, yeah, I ran up to the body. The body didn't have a head. Well, did you check the vital signs? And it's somewhat humorous, but at the same time, it's really important, right? That we need to know exactly what you did, and we need to know, make sure that the person is dead. Usually this is going to be using a teamwork approach. We're going to have a coroner or medical examiner. They're going to be the ones who usually call official time of death, unless an ambulance crew responds and they're empowered to do so. So you're going to go through all that, Officer Jones, everything up until the point that you arrived, right? So after you found the body, what did you do? Well, I looked around. Okay, tell me how you looked around. Where did you start? Show me, right? And then they're just going to step by step look at every single detail. And when I say, being facetious as it is, questions of CPR are really, really important, right? Because if the person's dead and they're like, yeah, did you perform CPR? Yeah, I did. Well, that tells us something that maybe is not readily obvious. So if you've ever taken a CPR course or you're certified in CPR, you know that if you do CPR correctly, you are going to break at least 1 or 2 ribs of the person, right? So when you're doing chest compressions, if you're doing it correctly, you're going to break ribs. So that being said, when we get this body on an autopsy table and they have broken ribs, we'll have an explanation, right? So it won't be confusing. It won't be, well, person was stabbed, but then he has these broken ribs. Maybe there was a struggle. No, the officer performs CPR or the ambulance crew performs CPR, right? So we're going to go through all that with the officer up until the moment they say, okay, now we arrived at the scene at this time. Can you confirm that? Yes, I can. Cool. Or they have all the information that they gathered from the officer. They're going to get the responding officer is going to file a report. They're going to take the report. They're also going to take probably a look, if not the full notebook that the officer carries, right, to double check his notes to see if there's anything in there that they need to ask questions about. Again, they're observing, they're collecting information, right? I mean, that's what they are. They are an information sponge, just absorbing everything they can. So we're going to do that with the first responding officer, and we're going to do that with, if there's an ambulance crew, the ambulance crew. Where were you when you received the call? Why did you take the route that you took? When did you arrive? When you got out of the truck, who was the officer already on the scene? Right, and you're going to separate the officer and the ambulance crew, and just like you separate all the other witnesses, because again, we are humans, and subconsciously, like, we kind of make stories match to fill any kind of cognitive dissonance that we may have. So you're going to ask the ambulance crew exactly what they did to the person, right? So you're going to take note of, did you perform CPR? Did you use a defibrillator? Did the officer use a defibrillator, right? So were there shocks delivered to the heart and through the body, which that will account for burn marks. Again, if you use a defibrillator correctly, you are going to burn the person, because you are literally sending electricity from their skin, through their skin, across their heart. You're going to cook them a bit. And we want to know that, right? We want to make sure that everything makes sense. We're going to ask the ambulance crew, how did you get into the scene, right? What's the path that you took? And we're going to compare that to the responding officer, right? What's the path that you took, responding officer, to make sure that we know where the points of entry, the points of ingress, and the points of egress, points of entry and points of exit are. Hopefully the responding officer and the ambulance crew followed the same path, right? Because that means that that path is contaminated, right? That path is everything in that path is destroyed evidence. So we hope they take the same path. Now, does this always happen? No. Does it regularly happen? Not really. Your first response is to save lives. So we're going to figure out how you got in, how you got out, etc. Ambulance crews are interesting. Again, because if the body if the person is struggling to stay alive, they will transport. Even if they know the person's going to die, they're going to transport and they're going to try to do everything they can. If the body is dead, like when they arrive and there's literally nothing that they can do, depends on the jurisdiction, but usually they're going to leave the body there. Now, some jurisdictions allow the ambulance crew to cover the body in a sterile tarp or a sterile sheet. This can play both ways, right? There are good things and bad things about it. Bad thing is you're introducing something new to the crime scene. I mean, it's sterile, so that's a plus, but you're introducing something new. But then you also have the good aspects of it. You're preserving the dignity of that person who is deceased, especially from onlookers, because again, as soon as you have ambulances and police cars, and you're gonna have onlookers. It also helps protect any trace evidence that's on the body, right? So keep in mind that if we're on an outside scene, the wind is blowing, right? It could blow trace evidence off the body. But if we have a tarp or a sheet over the person, it's going to help at least protect and insulate that trace evidence. So again, it's really a kind of a jurisdictional thing, and kind of a preference thing of how the ambulance crew will proceed. But again, if there's any hope of saving the person, if I mean, even if it's like they have a 0.000000001% chance of coming back to life, they're going to be transported, and that makes things kind of difficult, right? It makes things really difficult, because as soon as they start transporting the person, they're putting them on a gurney, right? They've introduced the gurney to the scene. They put the person on the gurney. They may put the person on oxygen. They may be using defibrillators. They may be using, all kinds of different techniques. In the ambulance, they may be using epinephrine to restart the heart. So introducing chemicals into the system. That there's just when you have to transport somebody and that person later dies, it definitely puts a little bit of a glitch in your investigation. As bad as it sounds, if you're going to die, we'd rather you die at the scene, where we can look at all the evidence, see your exact positioning, all that information, as opposed to if you're going to die, you die on an operating table. Well, yeah, we're going to send you down to pathology and we're going to have an autopsy performed, but that trace evidence has been destroyed. Anything on you has been destroyed, between the ambulance ride, between the prep for surgery, between the sterilization for surgery. You can kind of see where I'm going with this. So detectives, we're going to be asking a lot of questions of the responding officer, and we're going to ask a lot of questions of the ambulance crew. Now, when I say we're going to also get we're going to get details from the 911 call. Detectives will try to get that as soon as possible. And we're going to talk about why here in a moment. We're going to kind of go through and look at some red flags that should stand out during 911 phone calls. So we'll look at that here in a moment. But they're going to talk and get caught up to that exact moment that they arrived, right? Only after they are caught up exactly everything that's happened to the moment that they've arrived will they officially take command of the scene, right? So once they officially take command, once they assert that we are now in charge of the scene, they relieve the responding officer of his duties, not he's being fired or anything like that, but duties at the scene, so that the officer can then go file the report that needs to file, and maybe go to counseling or whatever needs to happen. So once they take command, their order of responsibilities is at this point preserve the crime scene, right? Because it may not be a crime scene, and we're going to talk about suicide investigations a little later, but we want to preserve the area. We want to preserve the potential crime scene. Now, it's really difficult for us to always navigate what the potential crime scene is, right? So how far away from the body is the crime scene? Because the crime scene encompasses everything that transpired in the commission of that crime. So we have to be cognizant of the fact that we may have to expand our crime scene, or we may contract a crime scene, but usually expand our crime scene as we get more information. So the broader we can make the crime scene, the broader we can push people off, the better. If we later realize that we actually have a larger crime scene than we thought. So at this point, they're not worried about preserving life, right? They're homicide detectives. They have absolute. The reason they're called is because there is somebody dead, right? I mean, that is that issue of preserving life is gone. It's done. It's over, right? So we're at this next step of preserve the crime scene. In doing so, we need to hold all witnesses, right? So everyone who saw the crime occur. If you recall from our last lecture, it's also the first responding officer's duty as well to separate witnesses, right? Put them in the back of patrol cars, because there'll be a bunch of them there. They're detained, for lack of better words, but back of patrol car, like, they're not getting out, so you know where they are, and they're not talking to anybody else. Make sure you turn the radio off in your car, obviously, and talk to them as soon as possible, so that you get their memory is fresh and they have a really good recollection, and also so that you're not violating their civil rights by holding them in a car. You're also going to hold all subjects, right? So when we say a subject, we mean basically person of interest, or the perpetrator, or the alleged perpetrator, right? So remember, first responding officer's duties: preserve life. Second is capture the perpetrator. Then third is preserve the crime scene. Well, if the perpetrator is captured, we're going to hold them at the scene. We're not going to immediately transport them back to the station. We're going to put them, they're going to be cuffed, and then they're going to be in the back of a car, with getting no information or anything like that. They're going to be facing probably away from the crime scene if we can. We're going to hold them there because they might decide to confess. They might decide to walk us through what exactly happened. Again, and if we can get their statement when it's fresh, and we'll talk about problems with their statements in a bit. If we get it when it's fresh, then all the better. At this point, we're also going to initiate a personnel log. So anybody who enters the crime scene or exits the crime scene has to, on a log, right, write their name, the time that they entered, the purpose for why they entered, and then they will have to write the time that they exited or left the crime scene, right? And this allows us to do control of the crime scene and say, okay, you can go in, but you have to follow this path. So we don't send all the CSI texts in at one time. You know, we control it as much as humanly possible. We're also going to probably send responding officers, and detectives are going to do this as well. They're going to record license plates of every vehicle in the area that they see. Right, so any vehicle that's parked, if they're parked even in a driveway, whatever, they're going to record license plate numbers. And the idea is those are people that may have seen something, may not know they've seen something, and you can talk to, right? So it tells you exactly who's there because you know who the owner of the vehicle is. You just run their license plate. So it kind of gives you that extra information. So when we talk about arriving at the scene, right, we're going to look at the vehicles. We're going to take note of everything. One really big thing to note is, again, note the time of arrival, right? Officers have to, and this cannot stress this enough, this is why we repeat it so much, officers need to note the time of arrival. Because time and time of arrival for responding officers and time of arrival for detectives is very important, because small things like time, they are the first thing that I would cover in cross-examination. Cross-examination is, maybe I represent the suspect or the defendant in the case, and I'm going to start asking the officer, okay, you responded at this time, correct? Right, and we're going to start that rapport because we want to build a timeline. Right, so the prosecution wants to build a timeline, the defense wants to build a timeline. So it all definitely starts with the time of arrival. Now, this is important because, especially if the defense is claiming an alibi, right? So if they say they have an alibi, time then becomes really important, right? Because if, you know, theoretically their alibi could be true because you missed or you misremembered your time of arrival, or you didn't record it right away, so you're actually off by 2 or 3 minutes. Those 2 or 3 minutes could be the difference between a person having a legitimate alibi or being exposed as lying about the alibi, right? And which can mean the difference between a conviction and an acquittal. So time is so important. It also makes the investigators slow down and focus, right? So when they arrive at the scene, their adrenaline's going too, just like the first responders, right? I mean, it's a very adrenaline-packed thing, and it's a very emotional thing as well. So if they can have, humans are all like this, right? If we can have a small task to focus on in something that's really stressful, that is really difficult emotionally, we have a small task to focus on and just focus on that task, even if it's just for a minute. What it's going to do is it's going to help calm us down, right? It's going to slow our breathing, because now suddenly I can control the time. Like I'm in control. I can record the right time. I can do the steps that I need to do. I can write them in the notebook, right? It kind of gives you this process which allows you to slow your respiration, which is going to slow your heart, which is going to slow the adrenaline in the body, right? And start that process of excreting the adrenaline in the body that gets released when you respond to a scene. And we want that because we want the detectives to be as clear-headed as possible. Because remember, they're observing every single thing. Like, they need to note the color of the leaves of the tree, right? Had it turned to fall colors yet? Was it halfway there? Right? It's all very, very important. They're going to also, again, as part of this kind of focusing element, they're going to note the exact address of the scene. All right. So a lot of times it's especially in larger cities, it's not uncommon for officers to respond to shots fired on the 26th block of Madison Avenue. And you're like, that's a lot of room, right? So officers and especially detectives at this point need to record the exact address of what the scene is, right? This could be multiple addresses. Now we're starting to use, in addition to an address, we're starting to use GPS locations, right? So we can say the body was located exactly at this point using longitude and latitude, exactly at this tiny little point. This is where the body was located, right? And then we can say the gun was located over here, and we can do measurements that way. They need to make sure all official and non-official personnel who are present. They need to make sure that they are doing their job or that they are not doing their job, right? And I say not doing their job because if you have a gruesome, let's say it's a killing spree or something like that, you may have elected officials decide to come onto the scene, or you may have the top command of the police department come onto the scene. You know, the officer who has not done police work, but is really kind of a paper pusher, hasn't done police work in like 20, 30 years. They want to be on the scene so they can be seen, right? You might have the commissioner of police come to the scene. What we have to do in that situation is it sucks for detectives. Like they usually just pass it on to the rookie of the department if they can. They try to make those people feel really important. Because again, the commissioner, the police commissioner is their boss, right? And probably a law enforcement officer. Even though they deal with the more bureaucratic issues, and they're just trying to get their face in the paper. So you want to make them feel important, but you also realize that your duty at that moment is not, and your loyalty is not to the commissioner, is not to the chief, is not to the mayor. Your loyalty, your duty is to that deceased person, right? So this may mean having to have a hard conversation with elected officials of, okay, you can get your pictures taken, but then you need to leave, right? And we don't want non-official personnel on the scene, because it turns into a media circus, and it's not a good thing. So we want to make sure that all official people are there. And I say all officials, we want to make sure that we have our full team, right? Because this is a very much team-based exercise. So we're going to want to make sure that if we're going to go examine the body, that we have the coroner there, or that we have the right CSI techs there, or they have the right equipment. We're going to want to make sure that all the right people are there, and that the not so right people get their 5 seconds of fame and then get the hell out. So yeah, sometimes detectives have to take the line with their boss and say, you know, no, like I'm gonna have to ask you to leave. I mean, it's a hard thing to do, but again, their duty is to that person. And that's one thing that you have to remember throughout, is that it's a person that we're talking about. So they're also going to, at this point, observe the conditions of the body and any information concerning the death. Right. So there are if we have to describe the scene, and there's a list of 12 items that we really look at. Right. So the first thing that we're going to record is we're going to look at the sex, right, the appearance, the age, build, hair color of the deceased, as well as a description of the deceased's clothing. Right? So basically, you're getting all their demographic information, as well as looking at their clothing information, and again, what people wear. Does that make murder or rape or anything like that okay? Absolutely not. Um, but it does give us indicators, right? If somebody is just in their underwear, they're outside, like, it's going to give us an indicator that the sexual assault probably happened. So we want to record all the information about the deceased as possible. We want to list evidence of injury, right, and apparent cause of death. So we want to say, okay, oh, it looks like this person's throat was slashed. So, that was cause of death was, loss of blood or obstructed airway, whatever it is. Now, are they going to be great at this? Not the best, because it's ultimately up to the medical examiner, right, to determine the cause of death, to make even a pronouncement. So that being said, detectives are still going to use their best judgment, right? I mean, if you've heard gunshots and the person has gunshots in his chest and he obviously there's blood everywhere, like, you're gonna have a pretty good idea. So again, that's kind of a starting point for us. We're also going to look at the blood stains, right, that are evident, if there are any. And we're going to say, okay, are the blood stains wet or are the blood stains dry? Because that starts to give us a time frame, right? Because keep in mind, we recorded what time we arrived. Well, that we can look back and say, okay, at this location, so in Phoenix, Arizona, at 2:30 p.m. in the afternoon, the approximate heat was this, the approximate humidity was this. So again, we can understand and say, okay, wow, that body had been here for a while, or that body has not been here for a while, or maybe it's indeterminate. We just don't know, because the blood at this particular climate just dries so quickly. But we're going to take note of that. We're going to take note of, again, any bloods on the body, whether it's wet or dry, surrounding the body, whether it's wet or dry, etc. Obviously, the wetter the blood, the more recent the injury, right? And that becomes really important, because if a person literally just bled out, and the blood is wet, it's all around and all that stuff, that perpetrator can't be too far away, right? And so again, we start getting all this information. We can't make too many judgments based off of it, but it's supposed to start making the detective's mind think. We're also going to look at the color of the blood. All right, so is the color of the blood bright red, which suggests that an artery was hit, right? So basically, if you take blood or you get shot or you get stabbed in an artery, you're going to have very, very, very red blood, right? Whereas if you get shot or stabbed somewhere else, and it doesn't nick or hit an artery, then the blood coming out is going to usually be about the color of blood that you think about when you give blood, right? Or you get blood taken for tests or whatever. That kind of maroonish, purplish color. It can always go all the way to brown, and brown's kind of where we have our dried blood. But they all tell us where different things have come from, right? And again, if you hit an artery, I mean, that's lights out. I mean, that's a rough one to come back from. So if we see bright red, it's going to tell us, okay, what's going on there. We're going to look at the condition of the body. So in addition to noting the demographics of the body, we're going to say, okay, is the body, is it, what's the lividity of the body? Has rigor mortis set in? Has rigor mortis released? Things along those lines. And we're going to talk about what like liver mortis is, rigor mortis is, and things like that in a little bit more detail, or well, actually a lot more detail a little bit later, but they're going to want to take note of that, right? So if the body is in rigor mortis, if it's stiff, well, you're probably talking 3 hours to, it just depends, 24 to 48 hours after the person has been killed. Your body goes into rigor mortis, right, like about 3 hours after death, and where all your muscles tighten up and everything just, I mean, it's like a death grip. Like if you try to move somebody's arm, you're going to break it. And eventually, again, anywhere from 12 to 24 hours really is the range. The body will exit the rigor mortis stage, right? And then we're going to be able to start looking at where's the blood pooling, where's all this other information. But if we know somebody's in rigor mortis, right, we find them, we know that that person's probably been killed 3 to 12 hours beforehand, right? So again, gives us a time frame based upon our arrival. We subtract the 3 to 12, gives us a time frame of when this occurred. We're also going to take a look at the clothing in the sense of, are there gunshot wounds? Are there stab wounds through the clothing? Are there stab wounds just on the body? Right? How does that look? We are going to very, very, very carefully examine the hands of the deceased. And we are going to look to see if the deceased in their hands, if they have any wounds to their hands, or if they are holding or close to a weapon, right? We're going to look at that. Again, making sure that we're not disturbing trace evidence or anything along those lines. But if somebody has cuts all over their hands or bruising in their hands, that's going to suggest that they put up a fight, right? That the person struggled. And this is always a rough one. I teach this in some other classes, and we'll talk a little bit about it when we talk about sexual-based homicides. But I will take this note for a public service announcement. Again, anyone can be the victim of sexual assault, right? I've read studies that suggest that 1/3 of all women who attend college are sexually assaulted during their college years. Right, so at any given time on campus, 1/3 of the female population has been sexually assaulted while they were here at college. That is atrocious. That is staggering. That is baffling beyond belief how horrible people can be. That being said, sexual assault is also the most underreported crime there is. So there could be a lot more, potentially 2/3, right? Maybe even more of women are sexually assaulted while they're in college. That's a rough number to deal with. And men absolutely can get sexually assaulted. People who have different gender identities, who don't identify with the cisgenders, they can absolutely be sexually assaulted, and actually oftentimes statistically more likely to be sexually assaulted than somebody of a cisgender. But that being said, here's my public service announcement. If you are being, if a sexual assault is occurring to you, right, you're being sexually assaulted, the best hope that you have to survive, right? So we're not talking about ending the sexual assault. It sounds bad, and I don't like saying it, but that if the perpetrator is in a position where they're able to sexually assault you, they're not just going to stop. They're not going to come to reason. They're not. It's just not going to happen, right? That animal brain is kicked in, and they're doing, and that doesn't excuse it by any means. So rationalizing, talking is not going to help. the best thing that you can do is to pretend as hard as it is and force yourself as hard as it is to go along with the assault. The worst thing that you can do, the absolutely worst thing that you can do during a sexual assault is fight back. Now, I know we teach young ladies and young men too, to fight back, to kick the perpetrator in the groin, to you name it. Well, statistically, and when we look at studies, statistically speaking, people who do not put up a fight live. People who do put up a fight die. Right? So it goes from, so a sexual assault can go to a murder very, very quickly. Right? Again, that person is in this kind of like animalistic rage stage, which again is not justifying or anything like that of the behavior. So if you're going along with it, right, even if you don't say anything, I mean, that's fine. When they have completed their fantasy or their sexual assault or whatever their proclivity is, most of the time they're just gonna run and leave. But if you're engaged in sexual assault and or being sexually assaulted, I should say, and you start to put up a fight, right? Like you try to gouge the eyes of the perpetrator out, you try to kick the perpetrator in the groin, you try everything you absolutely can to hurt that person, to stop the assault, the more likely it is that person is going to transition from sexual assault to homicide so that they can finish their sexual assault. Right? So if you're ever in that situation where it's a forcible rape, male, female, cisgender, the best advice I have for you is to, as horrible as it is, try to detach emotionally, and go with it with the rationale of, I am just trying to live. I am just trying to live, right? Like that should be your end goal, is I am just trying to live. Because there'll be plenty of time for that person to get what's coming to them. Because if you survive that sexual assault and you report it, and that person goes to prison, guess who is not the most popular people in prison? Yeah, rapists. Not at all. They will get the shit kicked out of them repeatedly, on a daily basis. They'll get stabbed. They are the targets. So in that sense, is you really have to detach, put yourself somewhere different place emotionally, right? Completely detach, and go along with the sexual assault. Let that person do whatever their fantasy is, whatever it is, and go from there. Don't think that changes any of the legalities of it. So it used to be the law, right? It used to be the law that in order to establish there was a sexual assault or forcible rape, that the victim had to have physically fought back. Right, so if you take my Law and Society class, we actually look at that case. It was the law, I think it was Maryland, that you had to physically fight back, or else it wasn't a sexual assault. It was tantamount, if you didn't fight back, to consent. That law got knocked down really quickly, right? I mean, that's atrocious. But that's kind of the myth that we propagate, is like, fight back. No. And I'm not saying if that person pulls out a knife and they put it to your throat and you think you are going to die, that you should do everything in your power to survive. I mean, if that person if you have no doubt that they are going to kill you, you kill them first, right? run if you can run, hide if you can hide. If and only if you believe that this person is going to kill you, do you fight back? Right? Because worst case scenario, you die, which is what would have happened anyway. Best case scenario, you kill the motherfucker and get away. Right? And I'm not saying kill them, but disable them enough where you can get away, get to help. So that's my little PSA. And then I know I digress, but it becomes very, very important. Again, when we're observing, especially in cases where it's a fairly obvious sexual assault, most of the time you're going to see, if it's a sexual assault and the person has been killed, defensive wounds, right? So meaning like they've tried to put up a fight, and it's not to blame or say that, it's their fault that they got killed. Nothing like that. Nothing like that. But it's one of those things that's what you see, right? So the person, if they're half undressed and they have defensive wounds on their hands, you have a pretty good idea of what happened, right? You don't know who or anything like that, but you have a good idea of, at least you have a initial theory that you're going to start building, right? And building upon. So in addition, when we're looking at the hands, we're going to look at the body in general, not just the hands, but the hands also come into play here as well. We're going to note any jewelry on the person, the deceased. And we need to make a notation of it. We need to note every single piece of jewelry that's on this person, right? If they have a wedding band, okay. But what if they just have a wedding band? Now, some people choose just to wear a wedding band. Some people choose to wear their engagement ring and their wedding band. Engagement rings are usually a lot more expensive than wedding bands are. So it can tell us things, right? If the body does not have any jewelry on whatsoever, you also have to make note of that, right? You have to be cognizant and say, there's no jewelry found on the body, there was no earrings, there was no piercings, there was no, there was nothing. And your book makes this interesting notation. It says, defense attorneys have been known to resort to dirty tactics during trials. If they can make you look like a thief to discredit your testimony, they will do it. Now, I haven't seen this personally, and I don't know how often that happens. Again, perception of the public or perception of different people is obviously, their own and unique to them. But that being said, yeah, you do want to cover your own ass and make sure that you can't be accused of stealing anything. But defense attorney, that is the surest way to get a jury to hate you, is to be like, oh, so you stole their wedding ring. Well, okay, even if you did, it doesn't mean you killed the person, right? You're there because somebody else killed him. Like, you're a dick who's a thief. Like, we should try you for that, but like, you try to do that on the stand, you are going to piss off the jury royally. So take that with a grain of salt. You're also going to describe the immediate surroundings, right? And so we're going to talk about this when we get to chapter 7, but you're going to want to note the position of the body, right? So especially in relation to articles in the room. So where is the body compared, if it were inside, where's the body compared to where the chair is, right? Is the chair knocked over? Again, signs of struggle, things along those lines. You're also going to note, again, remember the responding officer should note this as well, but you are going to note where all doors are, where all windows are, where all furniture is, okay? And the conditions. So sometimes, ambulance crews, they will just plow a path to get to that person, right? They'll throw things out of their way to get to that person. You need to note that, right? Because there might be a discrepancy between the responding officer and what he says is, oh, the chair was standing, and then your notes show, oh, the chair was flipped over. Well, that's a discrepancy that we need to deal with, especially before we get to trial, right? And to reconcile and understand what happened. And that's where, again, talking to the ambulance crew, following their exact steps and tracing exactly what they did, that helps us reconcile that kind of middle ground of what happened to the chair. Why was the chair knocked over? Because if detectives see a chair knocked over, they're going to think, oh, there was a fight, there was a struggle. But if when the initial responding officer came in and he saw the chair was upright and the room looked normal except for the dead person in it, and then the ambulance crew comes in and to get to the body, they have to move the chair. They're just flip the chair out of the way, not going to move it gently. That takes us down two different paths, right? One is, okay, we have a very pristine crime scene. There was no fight. There was no struggle apparent here, versus there was a very clear struggle here, right? So again, that's why talking to responding officers, talking to ambulance crews, so crucial. It helps us to understand why things are the way they are. We also like to note doors and windows because we want to see potential exit routes, right? If a person is laying in the back room of their home and there's a door to the outside, but the front door is where it's the obvious point of ingress, of entry, we're going to may be able to start speculating that this person was trying to get to that back door, right? We don't know, but it's just theories, different things that are going to start popping up in our head. Were they trying to get to the door? Were they trying to get to a window? Were they trying to get to a phone? Were they trying to get to a weapon? Like what was going on? And noting where doors and windows are will help that. It will also help, oddly enough, when we look at things like blood, right? Or things like semen. If the body is found near a window and it's a hot, sunny day with no cloud in the sky, and you have sunbeams beating down on the blood and the body, it's going to dry it much quicker than much more quickly, I should say, than if this occurs at night and we don't have sunbeams directly beating down upon the body. So you're going to want to note all of that. You are also going to take note if there's a weapon nearby. You're going to take note of the weapon and the position, but you are not going to touch it, right? We do not touch it until we have the whole crime scene photographed, until we don't disturb anything until it's photographed, it's mapped, it's, CSI has done what they do. But you're going to say, okay, there was a weapon here, right? So maybe this person had a weapon, they were shot, obviously implying the other person had a weapon, so they didn't trust this person, versus, oh, they didn't have weapons, so maybe they did trust this person, right? So again, it just sparks different theories in our head. You're going to look for bullet holes, right, in the surrounding area, or fired shells. Now, at this point, you still do not collect them. You just note where they are, and you note how many they are, and all of that jazz. Now, I'll tell you this: it can be very, very, very difficult to think broadly enough to find fragments of shells or fragments of bullets or bullet holes, just because you can't always tell what a bullet hole is. They're not always nice, pretty, and round. And you sometimes have houses that are in really run-down condition, holes in them, and things like that. I'll say this: the detectives who worked on the Boston Marathon bombing, they had a really rough task, because basically what happened was the there were pressure cookers filled with basically buckshot, right, and nails and you name it. They had to go around and take note of every single little tiny piece of buckshot, like where it was, what hole it caused, if there was a nail sticking out of a wall, what it was. They had to go on the roofs of the buildings that were surrounding the area to get things like nails, to get things like the pellets, to get things from the actual bomb itself. So again, you have to be very, very observant and realize that, okay, I need to take note of everything. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this hole wasn't caused by a bullet, but I need to note it, right? And note like how sure you are, right? If you're very, very sure, then note you're very sure. If you're not, then say you're not sure, but there is this hole that is of interest. Okay, you're also going to, I promise this is the final one, and then we'll kind of move on. You're also going to look for the presence of drugs. So prescription drugs or non-prescription drugs, over-the-counter drugs, legal drugs or illicit drugs. You're going to look for those. You're going to look for bottles, right? So pill bottles. You're going to look for alcohol bottles. You're going to look for glasses, right? The idea is potentially this is a drug overdose, or maybe this is a suicide, right? So we want to take note and see if there's any pills, or we want to take note and see if there is alcohol present, right? Mixing, obviously, too many pills with alcohol, depending on the type of pill, can be fatal, right? So it's just stuff that we want to know. Right, so that's what you're looking at when you're talking about, you're looking at every aspect of the scene, right? You're looking at all the information that's surrounding the body, including the body, looking at those 12 factors, right? You're also going to note weather conditions, right? And we kind of discussed why. You're going to look at lighting conditions. So this is a really good, this is really important because what if the person acts like the perpetrator was going to come and they were going to kill John Smith, but John Smith looked a lot like John Doe and it was real dark outside, and so the perpetrator kills John Doe thinking it's John Smith. Well, we might go into John Doe's history and try to find people who had hits out against him or things like that, when in reality it was John Smith that we should be looking at their background. Yes, they're alive, looking at and seeing who their enemies are and that sort of thing. So noting how well lit something is can tell us, was this person intended to be the victim, or is there a chance they just made a mistake? Right. So again, very important. You're also going to look for points of observation. So generally speaking, this is places where people may have been able to see the crime occur, right? So let's say it occurs on a sidewalk. You're going to say, okay, well, people walking directly behind the sidewalk and across the street, and maybe in the shop facing the body, they're going to be able to see it. If you're talking like indoors, the person might have a beautiful bay window, right, where the crime occurred, that overlooks a neighbor's bay window or overlooks the window of a neighbor. And you can say, okay, that's a point of observation, right? The neighbor might have been able to see through the window and see something going on. So we want to look at any potential places where people could have seen what happened. And we're also, especially in this day and age, going to look for possible video surveillance locations, right? So if you ever travel abroad and you go to England, especially known for this, London is especially known for this. Basically, every square inch of metropolitan London is under police camera, right? So you basically cannot get away from a police camera anywhere you go, like outside, obviously, in London. You're always on camera. So video surveillance, You know, if you have a homicide in London, like you're probably going to have video surveillance of what happened. If you're not, unless in the United States, where it's not as common, and especially, I mean, you know, different cities have um, different setups. But if United States, where we don't surveil every person 24 hours a day, um, surveillance tapes become very, very important. Uh, Largely because you want that person, if that you want that tape as soon as possible, right? And when I say you want that tape, you want that tape to be collected in a proper manner, but you want that tape to stop recording. So a lot of video surveillance tapes, the way they work is they record for, let's say, 8 hours, then they erase themselves and record over themselves, right? And so so the best you can get is 8 hours. Well, after that 8 hours, it starts to erase what transpired. So the best thing you can do, look at those surveillance, find this where those points of surveillance videos are, go into the establishments, say, we need you to hit stop. Just take the disc out, whatever you need to do. We will have techs come in, photograph everything else, but you need to hit stop, right? Again, the idea is that way it's not recording over what transpired. Only after that, the detectives have gone through kind of this mental check and this really broad observation of the scene as well as the body, only then should they begin with the arrival checklist. And the arrival checklist is in your book, and we'll discuss it in a little bit more detail next class. Now, there is a difference between the duties of detectives and the chief or the lead detective, right? So you're going to have one detective who is going to be the chief detective, one in charge. So you will have detectives respond to a scene. It's not just the one person. And so the chief detective is probably going to respond after the other detectives have responded to the scene. So first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to ensure that the investigators are already on the scene. And you're going to want, if you are the chief detective, you want to get a briefing, right? And you want their theories and you want their observations, because you're in charge. So you need to understand what they've done, how far they've gone, what they think is going on. You need to have all that information. The next thing you need to do is then you go and you re-interview the responding officers, uniform personnel, the ambulance crew, if they're still there. You re-interview them personally. And again, the idea is try to, if they've thought of something in between, or maybe you can catch something that the other investigators didn't, or if the stories start to really diverge, you know, we have a problem. So you're going to do a re-interview. You are going to give priority to remove witnesses or suspects to the station. So generally speaking, only when you arrive as the chief detective will we take a suspect into the station, because you've given that authorization. And key witnesses, right, material witnesses, or witnesses who saw the crime itself, we will generally take them into the station as well. Obviously, they're treated a little bit better, but you know, with the rationale of like they could be accomplices, we don't know, but we need to know everything they need to know, right? Of okay, what happened? Tell me everything from the beginning, and they'll do it in the station. Where again, if we're in a very big kind of a gang community where the discussion is you know, you don't talk about what you don't rat on other people. If we interview you at the scene and we're talking to you at the scene and you are a material witness, suddenly your life becomes in jeopardy. But if we take you to the station, nobody knows what happens behind those closed doors, right? And generally speaking, the conversation is going to be recorded. It's going to be video recorded, and you can play that and we're going to talk about when, but generally you can play that before the jury. So they can see like, okay, this person, when they first reported it, they were calm, they were cool, they were collected, right? Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Well, it really just depends on who the witness is. And we're going to see that in a little bit. They're going to also use an assignment sheet, right? So the investigators have already observed it, taken in the scene, made their observations. Now, you as the commanding officer, the commanding detective, you're going to use an assignment sheet and tell the investigators what exactly they are doing. And then the investigators will go and do that. So they already have an understanding of the scene. Now they have specific tasks that they have to go and perform. You're also going to establish a suitable command post, right? Again, this is going to be outside of the scene. You will never have a command post inside a scene. You see there a lot of police departments, especially in larger cities, they have mobile command centers. That's great, because that means that people are not screwing up the crime scene, right? If reporters are coming by and they're trying to get information, they're going to go to the command post. And from the command post is where you really do lead the investigation. So you're not on the scene, like you're not contaminating the scene, but you're close by and you have resources at your disposal. That's hopeful. But if you don't, you at least need a central area where people can check in, where investigators can check in, where investigators can debrief, et cetera, et cetera. That's suitable just depending on where you're at and the conditions that are surrounding you. You're also going to designate an officer to keep a running timetable of events, right? So it's not enough that you have to sign in and sign out to get in and out of the crime scene. We are going to task one of the officers, usually somebody of lower rank who's kind of a rookie. They have to keep an exact time log of everything that they've found, right? So there's the detectives, assuming they get a search warrant, and they're conducting a search at the scene, and they find a pencil that's been broken in half. Guess what? This officer has to write down exactly what time they found the pencil that was broken in half. Even if it has nothing to do with the homicide, they still have to write it down, right? They are keeping a running timetable of everything that happens. And the idea is that way you can go into court and you can say, yeah, here's the first thing that I did. I ordered this person to do this person to do this person to do this. At so-and-so time, this person reported back. And again, the officer is going to be making that timetable. They're going to say, okay, investigator A reported back at 0700. Investigator B reported back at 0800. Investigator C reported back at 0730, right? So they're going to ensure that we have a running timetable, that we understand everything that's happened, so that we can make sure that our investigation is a good investigation, and again, try to make it as solid against a defense as possible. Right? Now, if the victim has been removed to the hospital, we have to make sure that the proper procedure is followed, both at the crime scene itself, right, even absent the victim's body, but also by hospital and hospital personnel. Right? So if somebody passes in a hospital, it's usually up to the ME whether or not they're going to do an autopsy, or the pathologist, and maybe family consent. I mean, there's all kinds of situations when it can occur, but they have to be very, very careful, right? So let's say you have somebody who you got to the hospital, you got hooked up to all the the breathing tubes and everything. You feel like IVs going in them. You have everything you possibly like. They just look like they're a robot. All hospital staff is permitted to do in those cases is to disconnect the IV or disconnect the tube or whatever it is from the machine. They cannot remove anything from the body, right? So if the body is person died and they are split wide open because they're in surgery and they have a breathing tube down their throat and they have this and that and that, all of that has to stay exactly as it is, right? Generally speaking, even surgeons are discouraged from sewing somebody up if it's a potential homicide victim, right? Because we want the medical examiner to be able to get in and see, okay, this is the condition of the body that I received it in, right? Nobody was trying to repair anything. Nobody was trying to change anything. So I can see exactly what transpired, right? And see, maybe there was an intervening cause. Was, maybe the persons that got shot, the shooting actually didn't cause their death. Something else did. It just was coincidental. That you'd be surprised that it actually happens. Like people just have an aneurysm at the same time they get shot, and the aneurysm technically caused the death, not the gunshot. And that's the job of the ME, right? And the ME can't make that determination if people have gone through and tried to fix up the body and perform post-mortem care on the body. It's kind of our natural instinct, right? As human beings, especially people who go into medicine as caregivers, their natural instinct is post-mortem care. They're going to, and this is true in every hospital. First thing that you're going to do post-mortem care, you're going to check to see if they're an organ donor. You're going to preserve the organs the best you can if they are. If not, before you let the family come in and see and visit the body and say their goodbyes, you wash the body, right? You give them you take towels and washcloths and you wash the body. It's just something you do. I mean, even if they had bathed just right prior to it, partially because we lose control of our bowels, we lose control of our bladder, things along those lines, we clean everything up, right? Everything gets cleaned up. So if you die in hospital, that's kind of what happens is you go to force, you stay in your possessed bed, and usually they remake the bed over you and make everything look nice and bathe you, put a new gown on you, things like that. Obviously, we don't want that to happen in a homicide, right? Because you start washing a body, you've just washed away a lot of evidence. And a defense attorney is going to have a heyday with that. Or you change the gown, the defense attorney is going to have a heyday, right? So, understanding that and making sure that proper procedures are followed not only at the crime scene, but also at the hospital is absolutely key. You're also going to see if the suspect has fled, you are going to follow up with bolos and alarms, right? So if you have a description of the suspect's vehicle, right? So they did, let's say it's a drive-by, and the witnesses who have been separated all say, yes, it was a white Ford pickup truck. It had New York plates, and the first number was 7. They all say it. You're going to show BOLO. BOLO is a be on the lookout. That's what it stands for, be on the lookout. So this will, generally speaking, go to all of the criminal justice agencies. So police department, sheriff's department, state troopers, etc., within a certain geographical area. And they then are supposed to be on the lookout, right? As they're driving around, as they're doing their patrols. If they see a white Ford pickup and they notice it has New York plates, and they begin with 7, well, suddenly that pickup's going to get their attention, right? That's probably not, there's debate whether that's reasonable suspicion or not. I mean, that's kind of a legal technicality, but that's going to get your attention, right? And you are going to call that in as soon as you can. Like, if you find that truck, the white Ford truck, New York plates with 7 as the beginning number, and you find it 2 streets over from where you found the body, you're really, really going to be interested, right? And police are theoretically going to call back. They're going to say what they see, what they observe, and then it's up to you, in conjunction with, and you'll be in contact with your city attorney, um, whether or not they can go ahead and proceed to stop that vehicle, make sure that vehicle doesn't leave the scene or anything along those lines. But you can best bet that investigators will at least respond over and follow up. You're also going to disseminate information as appropriate to all units in the investigation, right? So your job, again, you are kind of you take in everything. You are orchestrating. You are the conductor of this orchestra, right? So you need to tell certain units, like the CSI unit, certain detective units, you need to tell them information, right? You need to give them the sheet music. You need to tell them information that they need to do their jobs, but they don't need all the information, right? CSI, they need information enough to know what they need to be taking a look at, what they're searching for, where they're searching for it, etc. They don't need to know that the perpetrator was wearing a windbreaker, right? Unless it's somehow relevant, unless there's like pieces of windbreaker at the scene or something like that, right? So again, you disseminate information that's appropriate, right? So you don't overwhelm somebody with too much information, and you don't give them too little information that it doesn't help them. This also becomes a really big problem, is make sure there are not too many officers at the crime scene or present at the crime scene, right? So especially in homicides, officers will respond like crazy because it's part of our natural instinct, right? It's kind of part of our natural inclination to figure out what's going on. Like, I mean, this is a homicide. Like this attracts people, right? People watch homicide TV shows all the time. So officers, they're going to want to be there. They're actually legitimately going to want to help, right? But there's very little that a patrol officer can do besides go out and canvass the area, be on the lookout. We're going to talk about canvassing in a minute. And usually that's by investigators. So, I mean, there's, again, very little that police officers can do, but keeping in mind that the more people we have going into a crime scene, the more contamination that we get, right? So we want to make sure that we don't have too many officers. We have enough to secure the scene. We have enough to be talking to witnesses. We have enough to be doing whatever it is they're assigned to do, but not so many that people don't have anything to do and they're wandering across potential crime scene, right? So, yeah, officers will respond in droves. You want to make sure that they are dispersed as appropriate. So one of the things that you'll be ordering, in addition to a bolo, is you're going to be ordering a canvas, right? So a canvas is a door-to-door inquiry. It could be a roadblock inquiry, or it could be a brief interview with persons on the street to gain information, right? So usually this is conducted by the investigators, again, not officers. So again, there's really no reason to have too many officers on the scene. And what you're doing is you're really just looking at the general area of the scene, as well as potential points of ingress and egress, entrance and exit to the scene. So this should really be, really include, if we're talking an apartment complex, every apartment in that apartment complex, right? We want you to walk around to the fronts of buildings around the area, the backs of buildings around the area. Yeah, you might find a suspect or a dwelling that could have been missed or something like that. But yeah, that's your whole goal is to make sure that you go to every single door and say, hi, so and so. You introduce who you are. You don't talk necessarily about what happened. You say, there was an incident at this time. Can you tell me, what you saw, what you observed, if anything? And I mean, most of the time it's going to come out with like, people are going to say, oh, I saw this. And then they're not going to think it's important. And it might be unimportant or it might be important. Or you might have people who are just like, don't want to cooperate, which again, if you're in certain areas, like if you're in the south side of Chicago, like you do not get seen talking to the police. Like you do not. And again, the police officers can try and ask you questions. You can slam the door right in their face. They can't do anything about it. Oh, I will share this. I was in Alabama, teaching at the University of Alabama. Um, there was I didn't live in a great part of it, um, just because I'd never been to Tuscaloosa before. And so I was like, oh, okay, I found like a decently priced apartment. Like it was pretty cheap. And I should have that should have been my first clue that it wasn't the best place to happen. But there was another apartment complex like right down the street. And it was a really big apartment complex. And one night I hear sirens and sirens and sirens and sirens. And so of course, curious person I am, I flip on my little app, my police scanner, and find out that it's a person has been shot at the apartment complex that's adjacent to my apartment complex. And so I'm like, oh, I'm really interested in listening to it. And then I just kind of give up on it and fall asleep. Just thinking like, I'll talk about it in class the next day. At this point, my father is living with me. I take care of my father. And I come home that afternoon from class, and I open the door and my father goes, so the police were here. And I was like, what? Like I was taken aback. I was like, well, okay, why? And he handed me their cards, and he handed me 2 cards, and sure enough, they were homicide detectives. He said they were asking about our neighbor, like the person who lived literally like it was like an outdoor complex. So there was like a balcony, and then there was a staircase, and then there was another balcony, right? And so the person right on the other side, I mean, like legitimately just like right next door. And even having the training that I have, and even having the background that I have, my first reaction, and I asked him point blank, I was like, you didn't talk to him, did you? And my dad, like the look on his face was like, what the hell? I was like, you didn't talk to him, did you? And he goes, well, they started asking questions. And I said, yeah. He said, I told him, like, I don't know anything. I don't know what happened. I don't know anything about the neighbors. We don't talk. We haven't met, anything like that. And I was like, okay, how long did you talk to them? Like, I started grilling them. I was like, how long did you talk to the detective? He said, oh, couldn't have been more than like, 30 seconds, 40 seconds. And I was like, okay. I'm like, and they handed you their cards, and you closed the door, right? Yep. And you can bet that door was, I mean, we didn't leave for a little while, and that door was locked down like nobody's business. I definitely had a weapon in bed. Um, Again, it was just one of those areas where you do not get seen talking to the police. But what they were doing is they were doing a canvas. They were literally just going from apartment to apartment saying, like, do you hear what happened? We might have heard that this person was involved in it. This one of your neighbors. Did you see them that night? Do you know anything about them or anything about what like they do? Yada 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 and so forth. It ended up being really just weird. They moved out kind of like in the middle of the night, but then they needed back in, so they like bust open a window, and I don't know, it's just this weird thing. Um, but yeah, even that reaction of um, it was so natural, right? It was like you didn't talk to him, did you? And you kind of postpone, like, and like you put in the back of your mind, like, I'm talking about somebody, like I'm talking about a human being, I'm talking about somebody who's dead. Like, you should be wanting to help, but you're also trying to make sure that you're surviving. So that's why canvases, sometimes they can get us good information. Sometimes like somebody will say, oh, I saw this guy get out of a white Ford truck. He was about 6'2", and then suddenly, okay, yeah, he was a white male. Okay, white male. Suddenly, now we start to have a picture of a suspect, right? And maybe different apartments or different places that could have been observation points, color in different parts of our picture, right? So one person's like, yeah, he got out, he was a male, he's about 6'2". Do you recall what kind of skin color he had? That I don't see things that way. I didn't pay any attention. Well, you could go to the neighbor next door and say, oh yeah, I saw a guy get out of a truck. He's a white guy. I don't know. And okay, well now we know he's white. And then maybe another neighbor was like, yeah, I saw him get out. Yeah, he was a white guy. He seemed kind of tall. It could have just been his beard. I don't know. Well, now suddenly we have a guy who's 6'2", white with a beard, right? Who drives a white pickup truck with New York license plates that start in 7. That's a lot of information, right? That narrows things down way down. That's when we're talking like make arrest territory. So yeah, canvassing again, it's kind of just getting people to cooperate is difficult. One, again, myself included, apparently, but two, it's really just kind of filling in the picture, right? Of you don't expect somebody to have all the information, but you get little pieces of information, right? So somebody starts coloring in a little piece here, and another person colors in a little piece here, another person colors in a little piece here. And after a little while, you take a look and you have a picture, right? You can see kind of some kind of picture, some kind of pattern, some kind of something that's going to be of interest. Now that doesn't happen all the time. It doesn't even happen the majority of the time. Most of the time, canvases, people don't want to deal with it, and they just go about their business. But you can come across a suspect, right? When you're talking to somebody, like they answer the door and you notice that the sink behind them, they have clothes in it and they're covered in what looks like blood. Like you're probably at that point going to put that person in handcuffs. It could be a suspect. You don't know. So again, there's some legality issues there, and we'll talk about this a little bit later. But that's always a one-off, right? That you might be able to find a suspect. Now, that being said, because of the amount of information that can be generated from a canvas, you're going to want to use two forms, two tools, a witness form and a canvas questionnaire, right? And the idea is it kind of standardizes the questions that you're asking the witnesses, the questions that you're asking people as you canvass the scene. There are examples in your textbook of what a witness form and a canvas questionnaire look like. So let's quickly just talk about gathering statements from witnesses, victims, and suspects. So when we're talking about if we have a suspect, right, and keep in mind that we have them on the scene until the chief investigator says they can be released. Patrol officer is the one who takes the suspect into custody. The investigator's job then is to ensure that the suspect is not permitted to re-enter the scene. We do not, under any circumstances, let that suspect go back into the scene, because suddenly now there's a reason for his fingerprints to be there. Now there's a reason for his hair to be there. Now there's a reason. You see where I'm going with this, right? And he can also destroy evidence. So we don't let him enter the scene. We do interview the arresting officer outside of the hearing and the earshot of the suspect to determine the scope of their investigation, right? So we ask the officer who made the arrest. Maybe the guy fled, the officers caught him like 3 blocks away. We're going to find that officer that made the arrest, and we're going to ask him questions like, okay, what happened? Tell us exactly from the moment that you arrived. What time did you arrive? What did you do? We're going to do the kind of the same thing that we do with the ambulance crews and the initial responding officer. We have to do it out of the hearing of the suspect, so that the suspect doesn't change their story, doesn't like say, oh, he said this, so I got to say this. right? We want it kind of removed from that scope. And it allows us to see, okay, the arresting officer, how much investigation have you done? Right? Did you ask the suspect questions? If you did, like we discourage that, but I mean, if you did, that's okay. We just need to know what you asked and what the answers were. Right? Even if it's, do you have a weapon on you? I still want to know that. Right? And what the answer is. Now, remember, transporting officers should never conduct an interrogation during transport. We discussed this during the last class. There are some interesting cases that we also discussed, right? Like the Christian burial case, the Quarles case, Quarles v. New York, where there's not really talking to the suspect, but they kind of were. It is what it is. You are going to want to ascertain immediately, has the suspect been given their Miranda rights? Have they been read the Miranda warnings, right? You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can't be used against court of law. You've got to attorney. If you can't afford an attorney, one before I do you for any questioning, do you understand your rights? We just need to know, did you do that? Right? And if you didn't do that, you best believe the very next thing that you as an investigator are going to do is you are going to go over to that car, you're going to go over to that scene, wherever you're going to call whomever you need to call to read that person their rights. Right? Because anything they say before you read them their rights, like if you're asking them questions and it's an interrogation type setting, cannot be used in evidence. Cannot. Anything they say after, presuming they haven't chosen to remain silent or that they haven't chosen an attorney or something like that, and then say after you read them their rights, can come into evidence. Right? So we want to read them their rights as many times as possible, and we want to do it as quickly as possible, right? Because anything that comes out of that person's mouth, we want it to go into the ears of a jury, right? Like, say whatever you want to say, bud. Talk, right? You won't ever talk yourself out of trouble. Like you just. It's like when people like get tickets and like, oh well, I thought if I explained to it, no, you're not gonna talk yourself out of trouble. Just you're busted. But I mean, if you're facing like death row, or you're facing life imprisonment, like there's incentive there to try. So we want them to have the Miranda warnings, right? So that it can come into evidence anything that they say. Now, that being said, we also instruct the officers to document their observations, right? And any activities at the scene that they did with the suspect, right? So, if we see the suspect has a cut on his arm, we're going to ask the officer, did that suspect have the cut when you started chasing? Or did that suspect get the cut while you were chasing? Right? Because if they have a cut before they were chasing, maybe it's a self-defense case. Maybe it's a there was a struggle case, right? Versus, oh, they got the cut while they were running, like they fell over a fence. Well, we need to know, like, when did these injuries actually occur, right? And what did you do with the suspect? Tell me everything you said to the person. And like I said, we are going to Mirandize this person several times. So we're going to Mirandize them as soon as we arrest them, as soon as we put them in cuffs, we're going to read them the Miranda rights. We're going to put them in a car, we're going to read them the Miranda rights. Before we transport them, the investigator is probably going to come over and read them the Miranda rights. Then they're going to go to the jail. The first thing that's going to happen at the jail when they're going through booking is they're going to be read the Miranda rights. Then they'll be questioned, right? They'll go over into interrogation. The very first thing that officer is going to do is going to come in, he's going to read them the Miranda rights. All right, so the idea is you have a stopgap after stopgap after stopgap after stopgap after stopgap to ensure that this person has had their rights read. Now, that being said, upon the arrival at the scene, investigators are not only responsible for the investigation, but they're also responsible for the interrogation. Right? And we discussed about why interrogations are so effective. We looked at the read technique in a previous class and why the read technique is just designed to elicit confessions, which is problematic because we want people to tell the truth, not necessarily just to confess. So you're gonna get suspects, statements of the suspect. They're crucial to any investigation. Now, when the suspect says they do want to talk, very first thing you're gonna do is you're gonna read them the Miranda rights again. You are going to make sure that they understand their rights, right? So you are going to, a lot of places have like paper that puts their Miranda rights, what it means, and what it covers, what all it entails. It puts it into very simplistic terms, right? So I mean, they have it like at a third grade reading level, right? So that way, if you're dealing with a suspect who maybe doesn't have a high IQ or hasn't had much formal schooling, you can communicate to them in a way that they'll understand. Because it's one thing that's really important from a legalistic aspect is just because somebody has been read their Miranda rights, that's great, right? I mean, you can read me Shakespeare, doesn't mean I understand what the hell is happening, right? So we have to make sure that you understand your Miranda rights. And so we will explain them to you in a way that is very focused on you and targets, I guess, kind of your capacity, mental capacity. Then we also are going to want to obtain a waiver of these rights. Now, when we do the waiver, we can do it orally, right? Because I mean, again, we're going to have it recorded in interrogation rooms. But if we can get it written down, that's great. A lot of stations use simple forms that say, "I waive my right to remain silent," and the suspect will initial next to it. "I waive my right to an attorney," and the suspect will initial next to it, going through the rights. And then at the end, they will sign their name, date it, and put the time. And so that way we know that, look, they've waived each individual right, having understood the right, having been explained to them in a way that they can understand, not in a legalistic way, but in a way that a third grader could understand. That if they choose to speak to an attorney, like, we will get them one, and then we can't ask them any questions, right? If you ask for an attorney, if you decide to remain silent, we'll come back to you in a day, in about 24 hours, and we'll ask if you want to talk, and you can choose at that point to talk to us if you want to or not, up to you, right? I mean, we will explain it very, very well. At that point, if the suspect wants to make a statement, we're not questioning them. We are not asking questions. Let that suspect talk. Allow the suspect to make a complete statement. Let them and take note of everything they say, reduce their statement into writing, and have them sign it. Right, so give them a chance to review everything that they've said and make sure that, and correct any errors. And if there's any errors, have them initial it, and then have the officer initial below it, whatever. But have them sign their statement. Now, the reason we don't ask them questions is because we don't want to lead them down any kind of paths. Right? They're like, "Oh yeah, I'm going to confess." Well, okay, that made my job easy. Go for it. I don't want to distract them. I don't want them to recant. I don't want them to think, "Oh, you know what? No, I do want an attorney." No, just let them talk. Let them talk. And when they're done and they've signed their statement, then you can ask them questions. Right? But let them talk, because they're only going to talk themselves into trouble. They're never going to talk themselves out of trouble. Now, that being said, right, part of this idea of before you start the questioning process, you should evaluate the suspect for two things: their demeanor and their mental capacity. All right, so are they chill? Are they laid back? Okay, that's going to send us down a path. Are they aggressive? Are they an aggressive stance? Are they hunched over? Are they closed off? Are they sitting back with their arms crossed? Right? Like how are they coming across? because that's going to really impact how and what kind of questions you're going to ask. And we're also going to look at their mental capacity, right? So do they have the mental state from our best judgment that they do understand, right? The Miranda rights, that they do understand that they're waiving them. But also, and this happens sometimes, what if we have a suspect who has Alzheimer's and they can't remember, like they will tell you like right out, like, oh, this is what happened. And then 5 minutes later you say, well, you said this is what, well, I didn't say it. I don't know. And they get really, really confused and really like upset. So you're going to want to evaluate to make sure, like, where are we at? And we're also going to look at kind of on the insanity spectrum, right? Like, is this person legitimately sane, or is there going to be a case for insanity? Because if there is, let's go ahead and get a mental health evaluation right now, because we're going to have to get one anyway. And that way it saves us time and it saves us any potential problems with evidence. So not only is this going to guide the investigation and the possible charges and defenses that will get raised, but again, it determines what kind of questioning is appropriate, right? You know, asking a question of so where did you put the 9mm after you after the victim expired? Okay. To most of us, we're like, okay, 9mm, that's a gun. Victim expired. That means they're dead. But there are a lot of people that will not understand what that statement means. So you have to adjust, right? So what did you do with a gun? The thing that you used, the gun, after that person died, after they stopped moving, they stopped breathing. What did you do with that gun? Right, like one is very different from the other. They're asking the exact same question, but we are using their demeanor, their mental capacity to determine what kind of questioning is appropriate. Investigators should also determine whether the suspect is speaking rationally, right? If the suspect is going off on like these weird like tangents, they could be under the influence of drugs, right? Like they could like have taken Molly or LSD or whatever, and we have no clue what the hell they're talking about. If they're speaking rationally, that's going to tell us that probably they have more credibility and they are being they're not necessarily, let me rephrase, they're in a better place in terms of understanding what's happening and really being able to contribute to the investigation. Now, we're also going to look and see, do they answer questions in a straightforward manner, or are they evasive, right? So there are big differences in words. Trying to think of a good one. Here's a great one. There's a difference between in and at, right? So think about this. I was in the hotel versus I was at the hotel. In the hotel implies that you were staying there. At was, well, you were physically present, but I don't know if you were staying there or not. Maybe you're working there. Who knows, right? So again, we want to know what words they're using. And some people, they'll just say in or they'll say at, like, and they know what they mean, right? And they're not trying to be evasive, but it's our job to follow up and say, okay, I'm going to ask you this follow-up question just to clarify, what exactly do you mean? Now, if they're trying to be evasive, right, if they start trying to play you and say, well, that truck that you know perfectly well is theirs. Yeah, that truck, it doesn't belong to me. It's not mine. I haven't seen that before in my life. Okay, right? Like you're lying. You're being evasive. Straightforward is, yes, I shot the person. This is the reason why I did it. Right? Evasive is, well, the gun went off. They won't say they shot the person. They'll say the gun went off, but they won't say they shot him. And again, when it comes to motive, they're going to be very evasive. So again, straightforward, I shot him versus the gun went off. Right? One is straightforward, one is evasive. Does the person appear intelligent or are they confused? If they appear intelligent, we might have a sociopath, which is horrifying in and of itself. But if they appear intelligent and they're having a dialogue, then they're confessing and they're talking, and okay, there's no problems with that, right? It's kind of the dream of every investigator. But if the person is confused, they can be confused for a few reasons, right? They can be confused as to what's happening to them, especially if we have people who maybe have a learning deficit or a developmental disorder. They may be confused by what's even going on, right? Let alone what actually transpired and what happened. Somebody can confuse themselves, right? So they can start off on one train and realize that they just said something that contradicted exactly what they said 5 minutes ago. And so they've confused themselves and they start acting off. So again, we're looking at, and making our best judgment as to how somebody's coming across. And again, a lot of this is just reading the person's tone, understanding their background, doing a little bit of investigation before you kind of talk to them, in terms of just doing like a real quick criminal history check and things like that. Do they have control over their actions, right? And this kind of goes hand in hand with, is the person in a stable emotional condition, right? So are they going from high to low to high to low? Are they screaming to crying to laughing to screaming to crying to laughing? Like they're just like, they keep bouncing back and forth between emotions. I can tell you a couple of things, and it's really situation dependent. But if you're bouncing back and forth between emotions, it's telling me that this person's not stable. Now, that's going to be my first reaction. Like, this person doesn't have control. And if this person doesn't have control, we have room for an insanity defense, right? And we have room for, they don't have control of their actions. How could they really wave Miranda intelligently and talk to you? Right? So you're probably going to stop, get a psych eval, and go from there. It's going to tell you different things, right? You might have someone who gets just unbelievably aggressive, right? They start out and they're friendly and joking around a little bit, and then you start talking, get a little bit more direct with them, and suddenly they just turn and they snap. That might tell you what happened at the crime scene, right? Even if they've just lied to you this whole time, the fact that they just got so angry that they just smash on the table, right? I mean, they're going to be shackled, but like they smash their hands down on the table, or they scream, or they curse, or whatever it is. You tell them, wow, this person has an anger problem. So maybe that needs to be what we look at in terms of motive. There might be some kind of anger issue under what's going on here. Again, we're going to see, are they under the influence of drugs or alcohol? If they are, we're not going to question them. All right, until those drugs or alcohol have left their system, we're not going to question them, because anything they say is not going to be admissible. It's not an intelligent waiver. I don't care if it's even marijuana. It's not an intelligent waiver, right? And if you're not stable, it's not an intelligent waiver. And we're going to stop. We're going to get a psych eval. We're going to get you to the hospital if it's drugs or alcohol, until we are 100% sure the it's out of your system, and then we're going to question you. We're also going to determine whether the suspect gives reasons for their actions, right? A lot of times before a suspect will confess, they'll placate a lot, right? And they'll say, well, I'm a good guy. I go to church. I'm a deacon. I donate to charity. Right? They're going to play themselves up, but we want to know, okay, not just that you did it, but if you can tell us why, that'd be super helpful, right? That would be super great. And they might try to give reasons that make themselves look good. If they're smart, they'll give reasons that will maybe drop it down from a first-degree murder charge to a second-degree murder charge or a manslaughter charge, right? And those really depend on mental state. So something that we definitely want to know. And I will say this, it's not improper to ask a suspect about their demeanor or their capacity. Right? It might be a real hard conversation. Demeanor, that's one thing of like, hey, you seem really angry. Is everything okay? Do you need to talk? That's perfectly fine. The capacity question, that's a little bit more difficult, right? If you're talking drugs or alcohol, that's not hard, right? Like, hey, I'm getting a kind of a whiff over here, and it kind of smells like alcohol. Have you been drinking today? You have. Okay. Well, that's where you stop it, right? Is until that person is sober, defense is going to have a field day. Where it gets real awkward and real tricky is when you're talking about either intellect, or you're talking about developmental disabilities, things along those lines, right? That one gets hairy. It's not a comfortable conversation to have, right? Because I think anybody with the soul doesn't want to say the wrong thing, but at the same time, your duty is to the person who's deceased, right? So maybe you have to say the wrong thing, or you might have to come across harsh or cold, but you're doing so in the best interest, not only of the person who's deceased, but you're also doing it in the best interest of that person, right? Because if they need a guardian, they need the court to appoint them a guardian or something along those lines, because they are so developmentally disabled or something along those lines, right? Then we have a problem. So an example I kind of go back to is if you've ever read the book Mice and Men, you'll know Lenny killing animals because he loved them so much, and then when a child kind of comes into play, there's a big problem there, because he had a developmental disability, and it's an interesting book. Read the book if you haven't. It's a good one. Definitely makes you think, and it definitely makes your heart go out to people. But you want to do what's right, and again, you're doing it for the person who's deceased, but also you're not trying to take advantage of somebody who is developmentally disabled, who might wrongfully confess, right? So that is one hallmark of somebody who maybe has developmental disabilities, is they are very eager to please, right? And if it makes you happy that they're confessing, then they'll confess. Even if they didn't do it, they'll confess, because that's part of that developmental disability is not, this isn't true for everyone, but this is true for definitely a population. Part of that disability is this need to please, right? And as long as everybody's happy and smiling, then you're okay, you're safe, everything's fine. That's where we have to ask questions, right? And make sure that we are, if somebody's just, giving us everything they've got, we need to be a little suspicious, because people don't usually just blatantly confess. We also need to take a look at a couple of things. We discussed this last class. I'll go through this fairly quickly. The 911 call. Investigators have to listen to it a bunch, right? So in addition to the saving suspects, 911 call is paramount. So actually in a recent study, 19% of homicide 911 calls were made by offenders who were posing as innocent victims. Right, so they called 911, said, "Oh, I just saw a guy shoot this other person," when in reality they're the ones who shot him. Almost 20%. Almost 20% of homicide calls, the person who's claiming to be an innocent witness is the perpetrator. Great thing about the 911 call, Miranda doesn't apply, right? Because they're making a voluntary statement. They're not in custody, nothing along those lines, so Miranda does not apply, right? So you don't have to warn them of the right to remain silent or anything along those lines. Let them go. That being said, there are 4 characteristics which will provide instant clues to whether a caller is involved in a crime. So the first is the caller doesn't make an urgent demand for help for the victim. Right? So if you've ever listened to a 911 call, you know the person calling is in a state of panic, is in a state of emergency. Even if they don't know this other person, it's going to be, please hurry, just please hurry, help, hurry. Just they're turning blue. Can you please hurry? Well, if the 911 call never says the word hurry or come quickly or this victim needs help, that's going to kind of cue us off, right? Oh, this person was shot. Yeah, I can't tell if they're dead or not. It's a big difference between please hurry, right? I mean, one is I mean, those are black and white, right? If there's no call for urgent help, because you don't want urgent help, right? Like you don't want police or paramedics to get there in time to save the other person's life, because then they're going to be able to point you out in court, right? You kind of want them to die. So there's like kind of that subconscious, you're not asking for them to hurry up. You're also going to look at ones that accept the fact that the victim is dead, right? This is especially true if the caller claims to know the victim, and definitely true if we're talking a family setting, right? There are some really creepy 911 cases that involve like parents who have murdered their children. There's one in the case, it was a Missouri case, I think, where she drowned her kids. I mean, it's just a horrible case. But they called 911. There's been some, and I don't think they called 911 in that case, but there was one interesting case where parents ultimately confessed to killing their kid later on, but they call and they say, you know, he was playing in the bathtub and he just, I turned my back for a second and I turned back and he's underwater and he's dead. There's nothing I can do. He's dead. Let me tell you this. I don't have kids. I don't like kids. Just no. But you are never going to convince a parent that their kid, especially if it's a little kid, is dead, right? Because it's just that instinct that you have when you have offspring, right? Of you are their caregiver, you are there to help, you are there to do whatever it takes to make them okay, right? So again, you're never gonna convince them that they're dead. Until they see them like in a morgue or something along those lines, and that's just a horrible moment. But if they just say, yeah, they're dead, like not a big deal, it's going to raise some red flags. Now, I mean, if they find like a skeleton, like we're going to be okay with them being like, yeah, they're dead. How do you know? They're missing skin and all of their organs. Well, okay then. Right. So it's going to be situation dependent. But Yeah, if they're convinced the person's dead, well, how do you know? If they provide extraneous information instead of information of relevant details. So if they give us, instead of just saying what the relevant information is, again, what you would do in a panic, right? You'd be like, okay, this is what you need to know. This, and this. This is what you need to know to save this person. This is what you need to know to get to this person, right? Like this. If they start going off like I do on tangents, and they give you superfluous information or extraneous information, that should tell you like you have that kind of, and this, you're calling 911 an emergency line, and you have that sense of calm about you that you can, and what's really happening is the suspect is trying to manipulate the situation, right? So trying to manipulate investigators before investigators even arrive, to try and paint the situation a certain way that maybe wasn't, right? So it's not just, oh, I heard a loud bang. I looked across. I saw somebody running out of my neighbor's house. I ran over they peeled out. I ran over quickly. They're here. They're bleeding on in the middle of the living room. You know, I don't know who those other guys were. Like, I know that, she owed people money, and she didn't always pay them back in time. So maybe like is something like that. But yeah, she's here and she's bleeding. She needs help. Okay. Does the fact that she owed people money, or like, does that help 911 at all? I mean, yeah, it helps investigators, absolutely. Does it help get us emergency aid? No. Is it relevant? No. What's relevant is, where are you? What's going on? Right. And also, they give a pattern of short answers. So yes or no questions. Right. Like is the person breathing? Yes. Is the person breathing? No. Are you in a safe location? Yes. Right. People in emergency situations, they're going to talk. Right. So you're kind of balancing this extraneous information versus just yes or no's. Right. And again, 911 operators are trained very well to kind of detect red flags. So kind of keep that in the back of your mind. Now, remember, we asked that 911 operators try to get the person to remain at the scene, assuming that the conditions are safe. Upon arrival at the scene, some additional clues, if the person stayed at the scene, that would indicate potential involvement, include that the scene is untouched. Like, if I find somebody and they are gasping in the middle of the street, like, I'm going to try like CPR, even if I don't know it, I'm going to try CPR, right? It's just, I mean, just what we do as people. So if the scene is pristine, like it's like a work of art, okay, well, like, wouldn't your natural inclination be to go over and try and help them? But you didn't want to touch them because you didn't want to contaminate evidence. That's going to be a red flag. The callers at the scene reveals unexplained knowledge to investigators. I'd like, so how do you know that they had ties to the mafia? Oh, I just know. Okay, what, like, where did this come from? Right, and they can't give you a where. The caller, who again hopefully is at the scene, does not mention any remarkable conditions at the crime scene. Right. So anything very notable, that they just don't talk about it. The caller shows a lack of fear for their personal safety. If you just saw somebody get shot, I'd be scared, right? Like, I mean, like, like, if I was safe, I'd go over and try to help the person. But I'd be on the phone, like, I'm like, is it safe? I don't know if it's safe. Like, because you're going to be worried about yourself and your family, or whomever first. I mean, just how we are. But if the person's like, they have no fear, they're like, oh yeah, I got shot. No, I'll stay. Yeah, that's not a problem. I'm sorry, somebody just got shot and you're just gonna chill there? like, and have absolutely no problem doing so, not scared at all, red flag. So again, remember that these are only preliminary indicators of involvement in the crime. And a lot of times there's often other explanations, right? So one explanation that comes up a lot is some people will remain really cool in very tense, urgent emergency situations, right? So I don't know if you've ever known people like this, maybe you are somebody like this, that when everybody is freaking out, or you have friends who are freaking out, losing their mind, suddenly you become very calm, right? And you're the voice of reason, and you're rational, right? Like them be freaking out actually helps put you in a good mental state to theoretically help them. Well, I mean, that's true 911 callers, right? If we have one that's very just calm, understands that 911 will get there as soon as they can, understands that this person's might be dead, might not be, whatever. Again, it could literally just be, it's a emergency situation. They're the type that gets calm, right? Most people, like in emergencies, they freak the hell out. Some people get calm. It's just how we're wired, right? So there's always other explanations. So these are just preliminary indicators. They are not like nails in the coffin. Now, when it comes to gathering statements, there's a really, this kind of whole lecture gets put up against what's called Rule 802 of the Federal Rules of Evidence, right? So basically in court, when we go to trial, there is Rule 802. Rule 802 is the rule against hearsay, right? So hearsay is a statement that was made outside of the courtroom, right? A statement outside of court that we are bringing into court, that we're using in court to prove the truth of the matter asserted, right? And to prove the truth of the matter asserted basically means you get up on the stand, right? And you're talking about a conversation you had with Bill about a school bus, right? And on the stand, this is an outside conversation, right? On the stand, you say, "Oh yeah, Bill told me that the school bus was yellow." Okay, that's a statement. The school bus is yellow, made outside of court. We're bringing it in court, and it's hearsay only if we're trying to prove that the school bus was indeed yellow. If we're actually trying to prove that he was pretending to be blind, but he accurately identified the color of the school bus, well, that's a little bit different, right? Because we're not trying to prove that the school bus was yellow. We're trying to prove that he was faking that he was blind, right? So if we're trying to prove the school bus is yellow, that if the statement, we're trying to prove that statement is true, then we cannot use it. It's called hearsay. Now, there are exceptions to the hearsay rule, right? And again, if you take, if you're in legal studies, you'll take a whole class on evidence, and we just studied the rules of evidence because they're so important, because they really ultimately determine who has the advantage in a courtroom. So there is Rule 803, sub 2 and sub 3, and they provide exceptions for excited utterances, as well as then existing mental, emotional, or physical conditions. So excited utterances, right? This is something that you just say spontaneously, you scream out, whatever it is. It's excited. And the idea here is, and the whole point of hearsay is we're trying to make it we're trying to ensure that people aren't lying. That's just really the whole point. And if you're excited and you scream something out, chances are it's probably not going to be a lie, right? An excited utterance, or then existing mental, emotional, or physical condition. So some kind of statement that talks about like, oh my God, I'm I'm terrified. Okay. That's a statement made outside of court. And you're trying to prove that, Bill said he was terrified. You're trying to prove that Bill was terrified. Well, you're trying to prove the truth of the matter asserted. So that's hearsay because you're trying to prove that Bill was terrified. But you could say it was an excited utterance, or you could say it was Bill's then existing mental, emotional, or physical condition. And then that's an exception because usually people aren't going to lie about in the moment, their mental condition, their emotional condition, and especially their physical condition. This encompasses, these two rules encompass what's called the dying declaration. And you've probably all have heard about this before. So the dying declaration is this notion that if somebody legitimately believes they are going to die, like, and their death is imminent, like it's about to happen, we generally are going to take what they say as true. All right. Because the idea is you're on your deathbed. Let's say like you're the biggest atheist there is, right? But you're on your deathbed. There's an old saying, there's no such thing as an atheist in a foxhole. Right? It's a military saying. Basically that when you are facing death, you want to know there's something after. Right? Even if the whole time, like your whole life, you've denied it, like we still want to know there's something after. Like death is, universally terrifying, right? Because what if there's nothing next? So usually, if you know you're dying, you're going to start telling the truth. Like you're going to have confessional time where you are just spouting out the truth. Because why would you lie in your deathbed? Like if there is something after, why would the last thing that you say be a lie, which could make you go to a bad place instead of a good place? Right? That's the whole rationale behind dying declaration. So if Bill is dying and the doctor said there's nothing more that we can do for you, sir, how long do I have? You have about 30 seconds. I mean, it's ridiculous, but okay, you have about 30 seconds. Okay, well, I just want my family to know that I love them. I want you to know that the killer was Mike. And he dies. That's probably going to be a dying declaration, right? Because he knew he was dying. And why would he have any reason to say that Mike was the killer if he was going to die? Now, I mean, there's always exceptions to exceptions, right? Think about like insurance fraud or, what have you. But usually we're going to take them as true until they are shown otherwise. So in order for a dying declaration to be admissible, right, the victim must believe, and this is subjective, but must believe that he or she is going to die. Second, the victim must have no hope of recovery. So it's not just that like they're convinced they're going to die, but there's still a chance that they could live. No, it's they believe they're going to die and there is no way they are going to recover. The declaration, third, must refer to, this is a subpart, the manner and circumstances that brought about the victim's condition and ultimate death, and the identity of the persona responsible. Right? So in other words, this is why I'm dying, this is who did it. Or this is what happened, this is who did it. Right? That's the only type of declarations that we call dying declarations that we come in. Now, in order for a dying declaration to be admissible, in most jurisdictions, generally speaking, the declarant, the person making the declaration, the dying person, must actually die. All right? If they have a just amazing recovery, dying declaration is not going to come in, right? We're going to make that witness testify. Like, if you're alive, we're dragging you into court so that you can tell us that this is what happened and that Mike is the person who tried to kill you, right? Like, victim survives, you have to testify. So you actually have to die. Now, here's where we get things that are, this is the tricky part of dying declaration. The declaration must have been otherwise competent and rational. So you will have to ask questions that prove the person was lucid and competent, right? So brain death is amazing. Research shows that, like, when your brain dies, it releases all these chemicals, and it's basically like LSD on LSD. Like, I mean, it's just the craziest thing. Like, and it's just, obviously indescribable because everyone who's experienced it is dead. So somebody who's dying, you have to make sure that those chemicals aren't taking over their mental state, right? So you have to ask questions of, Mike is the killer. Okay, what is today's date? What is your name? Things that they would be able to answer very easily. Of course, I mean, if you asked me today's date, I couldn't tell you. But ask me my name, I could tell you. But if I ask Bill's name, and Bill says, my name is Margaret, then I'm going to be like, okay, everything that this guy has just said, nope. Person's not lucid, not competent, right? And that's a really hard thing to be when you're dying, is competent and rational. That's really hard to be. So dying declarations, they can get tricky. But again, if the victim survives, they have to testify in court. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to transition now into a pre-recorded lecture on gathering evidence. So remember that there's the gathering phase as a part of our investigators' response. And the example that we are going to look at is excavating buried bodies. So please forgive me, there'll be a little bit of an introduction, and then it will jump into the remainder of the lecture.